She sold her tractor and bought 40 skinny goats, and they laughed until the drought killed the Angus herds. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell and the worst decision that became the best decision ever made on Texas soil. In the spring of 2019, Sarah stood at the edge of her family ranch in the hill country and watched the morning mist burn off the limestone ridges. The live oaks were draped with Spanish moss that caught the first golden light. The mockingbirds were singing their stolen songs from the fence posts. The air smelled of cedar and wild sage. Red cardinals flashed between the branches like drops of blood against the green. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead on the thermals that were already building. She wore her father's old boots and a straw hat that had seen better days. Her hands were calloused from rope work, and her shoulders carried the tension of a woman who had not slept through the night in months. She looked out at the 200 black Angus cattle grazing on the hills, and she felt a weight that no one else could see. She was 34 years old, and she had just buried her father 3 months prior. The Mitchell Ranch had been in her family for 4 generations. 200 head of black Angus cattle grazed on 1,200 acres of mixed grassland and oak savanna. It was a respectable operation. It was the kind of place that made neighbours nod with approval at the feed store. It was also bleeding money. Her father had taken on $300,000 in equipment loans to modernise the operation before he got sick. The payments were $12,000 a month. The Angus market had softened. Feed prices had climbed. And Sarah was holding a ledger that looked more like a suicide note than a business plan. She had 2 choices. She could keep doing what everyone expected her to do, or she could do something that made absolutely no sense to anyone but her. She chose the second option, and that choice nearly destroyed her, until it saved her, until it made her millions. Until it changed everything about what people thought they knew about ranching in America. This is that story, and I need you to pay attention to every single word, because what you are about to learn is not just about goats. It is about seeing what nobody else can see when the world is telling you that you are crazy. It is about trusting your gut when every voice around you is screaming that you are wrong. It is about the moment when you realize that the thing everyone calls weakness might actually be the greatest strength you will ever find. It is about standing alone in the face of mockery and knowing that you are right even when every single person you respect tells you that you are wrong. Sarah grew up on this ranch. She learned to ride before she could read. She knew every cow by sight. She could pull a calf at 2 in the morning, in a driving rainstorm, without flinching. Her father was a cattleman through and through. Angus beef was the gold standard of the American ranching industry. It was what the restaurants wanted. It was what the feedlots paid premium for. It was the pride of the Texas Hill Country. And it was killing the Mitchell family one invoice at a time. The first tragedy layer was the debt. Those equipment loans were not just numbers on paper. They were chains around her ankles. Every morning she woke up knowing that the bank owned more of her land than she did. The John Deere 8R tractor alone had cost $85,000, and it was financed at 6% interest over 7 years. The hay baler was another $40,000. The stock trailer was $22,000. The automatic waterers for the cattle were $15,000. The chute system was $18,000. The new fencing was $25,000. Every piece of modern equipment that her father had bought to make the ranch more efficient had actually made it more fragile. Because when the margins got thin, the payments did not get thin with them. They stayed the same. They grew with interest. They consumed everything. The second tragedy layer was the loss of her father. He had been the anchor. He had been the man who made the calls and shook the hands and kept the buyers coming back. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the fall of 2017, and he had fought it with the same stubbornness that he brought to everything in life. He did not tell Sarah how bad it was until the spring of 2018, when he could no longer hide the weight loss and the yellowing of his eyes. He kept working the ranch through the summer of 2018, even though he could barely sit a horse. He would get up at 4 in the morning and drive the ATV to check water lines because he could no longer swing into the saddle. He refused to let the neighbours see him weak. He refused to let the ranch slip while he was still breathing. He wore his old Stetson every single day, even when the chemo made him so tired he could barely lift his arms. He died in January of 2019 in the same bedroom where he had been born. Sarah held his hand at the end. The last thing he said to her was, "Keep the ranch running." She had promised him that she would, and that promise was now strangling her. Without him, the relationships frayed. The cattle buyers started offering less. The vet bills started climbing because she did not have his eye for early symptoms. She would walk out to check the herd, and she would see a cow standing slightly apart from the group. And she would not know if that was normal, or if it was the first sign of bloat, or anaplasmosis, or any of the dozen other conditions that could take a valuable animal down in 48 hours. Her father would have known. He would have seen it in the way the cow held her head, or the angle of her ears, or the tightness in her flanks. Sarah saw a black cow standing in grass. That was all. The third tragedy layer was the land itself. 1,200 acres sounds like a lot until you realize that the carrying capacity had been declining for a decade. Overgrazing from the previous generation had compacted the soil. The native grasses were giving way to invasive mesquite and prickly pear. The Angus needed high-quality forage. The land was no longer producing it, not at the density they were running. Every year Sarah had to buy more hay. Every year the hay cost more. Every year the profit margin got thinner. She was running a ranch that looked successful from the road, but was actually a house of cards built on legacy pride and borrowed money. The neighbours saw the black cattle dotting the green hills, and they tipped their hats. They did not see the desperation. They did not see the woman sitting in the kitchen at midnight with a calculator and a bottle of whiskey, wondering how many more months she could make payroll. They did not see the letter from the bank warning that the next missed payment would trigger foreclosure proceedings. They did not see the way she would drive into town and park behind the feed store, so nobody would see her crying before she went inside to beg for another week on her account. They did not see the empty refrigerator in the ranch house because she had stopped buying groceries for herself so she could afford mineral blocks for the herd. They did not see the collection notices for the equipment loans that she hid in the desk drawer. They did not see the way she would avoid the diner because she could not afford to buy lunch and she did not want anyone to know. They saw the Mitchell Ranch, and they saw tradition. Sarah saw a ship taking on water. The struggle started with the auction. Sarah had driven 3 hours to a livestock auction in Abilene because she had heard a rumour from a truck driver at the gas station. A goat rancher named Bill Hartley had gone bankrupt after a divorce and a bad business deal with a feed supplier. He had 40 Boer goats that were in rough shape. Skinny, ribby, wormy. Their hip bones stuck out like tent poles under their hides. Their coats were rough and patchy from parasites. Their hooves were overgrown and cracked, the kind of animals that made buyers shake their heads and walk away. The auctioneer could not get a bid over $300 a head. Sarah sat in the bleachers and watched those goats come through the chute. The smell of dust and manure and diesel exhaust filled the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The auctioneer wore a white straw hat and spoke in the rapid-fire cadence that only livestock auctioneers master. The crowd was sparse because it was a Tuesday afternoon and most ranchers were working their own places. A few old men in worn boots sat with their arms crossed, waiting for the cattle to come through. Everyone else saw failure. They saw animals that would need months of rehabilitation. They saw vet bills and feed costs and deworming schedules and hoof trimming, and no guarantee that these goats would ever be worth anything. They saw a dead end. Sarah saw something else. She saw animals that had survived neglect. She saw animals that had been eating brush and weeds because there was no hay. She saw animals that were still standing despite everything, and she remembered something her grandmother had told her when she was a little girl. Grandma Mitchell had kept a small herd of Spanish goats through the drought of the 1950s. When the cattle died, the goats lived. When the wells went dry, the goats found water in the cactus. When the grass turned to dust, the goats ate the brush. The old woman had told her that goats were the forgotten livestock of the tough times. That memory hit Sarah like a lightning bolt in that auction barn. But buying those goats meant she needed cash. Fast. The auction was cash on the barrelhead. She had $12,000 in her operating account, and she needed every penny of it just to keep the lights on, and the crew paid for another month. So she made the call that would define her life. She sold her John Deere 8R tractor. It was the most valuable thing she owned after the land itself. $85,000 of green and yellow iron that her father had been so proud of. She had washed it every Saturday. She had waxed it twice a year. She had taken pictures of her father sitting in that cab, with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. She had learned to drive it when she was 12. She had spent countless hours in that seat moving hay and grading roads and feeling like the queen of the ranch. She sold it to a dealer in San Antonio for $60,000 cash. The dealer looked at her like she was crazy when she said she needed the money in 24 hours. She took that cash to the auction. She bought all 40 goats for $12,000, and she drove them home in a rented livestock trailer behind her beat-up pickup truck. The first failure came within hours. She got those goats back to the Mitchell Ranch at 9 o'clock at night, and her foreman quit on the spot. Tom had been with the family for 15 years. He was a cattleman through and through. He had worked for her grandfather. He had taught her father how to rope. He did not do goats. He told her that this was an embarrassment, that her father would be ashamed, that she had taken a working cattle ranch and turned it into a joke. He walked off the property at 10:30 at night, and he took 2 of the cowboys with him. She was left with 40 goats that she did not know how to handle, and a ranch crew of one part-time kid named Cody, who was still in high school and had never worked more than weekends. Cody looked at the goats and looked at Sarah and said he guessed he could learn. He showed up the next morning at 5:30 with a notebook and a willingness that made Sarah cry. He was the only person who did not laugh at her. His mother had worked at the diner in town, and she had told Cody that Sarah Mitchell was a good woman who needed help, not judgment. Cody remembered that, and he stayed when everyone else left. The second failure came from the community. Word travels fast in ranching country. By Monday morning, the coffee shop in town was buzzing with the news. Hank Brennan, who ran the big spread to the east, actually laughed in her face at the feed store. He told her that goats were coyote food. He told her that no respectable restaurant in Austin would put goat on the menu. He told her that she had taken a working cattle ranch and turned it into a petting zoo. He said it loud enough that the other customers stopped and stared. The other ranchers nodded along. Some of them felt bad for her. They thought grief had broken her. Others thought she was just stupid. Old Man Perkins, who had ranched since before Sarah was born, shook his head and said that the Mitchell name was finished. The feed store owner stopped extending her credit. The vet stopped returning her calls because he did not treat small ruminants, and he did not want to start. The third failure came from her own body and spirit. She did not sleep for 3 days, trying to figure out goat nutrition. She gave them the wrong mineral mix because she was used to cattle minerals, and goat metabolism is completely different. And 3 of them got sick with copper toxicity. She stayed up all night tubing electrolytes into a doe that was crashing. She cried in the barn at 4 in the morning because she was alone and she was scared. And she had just traded the symbol of her father's success for a trailer load of animals that everyone said were worthless. Her boyfriend of 2 years, a lawyer from Austin named David, told her that he could not watch her destroy herself. He packed his bags and left on a Sunday afternoon while she was out checking water lines. He left a note on the kitchen table that said he hoped she would come to her senses before it was too late. The banker called her in for a meeting on Wednesday and suggested that she consider selling the ranch outright before she lost everything. Her mother, who lived in Dallas, stopped answering her calls because she could not bear to hear what her daughter was doing to the family legacy. Sarah was completely isolated. She had 40 skinny goats. No tractor, no crew, no support, no sleep, no credit at the feed store, and a community that was waiting for her to fail so they could say they told her so. But here is the thing about hitting rock bottom. When you are there, you stop caring what people think. And that is when you can actually hear your own instincts again. The turning point happened by accident. It was July and the heat was already brutal. The temperature had hit 102 for 6 days straight. The ground was cracking. The cattle were standing in what little shade they could find, with their heads down and their breathing laboured. The water troughs were evaporating faster than the wells could refill. The sky was a hard white bowl with no promise of rain. Sarah had moved the goats to the back pasture because it was the worst pasture on the ranch. It was full of mesquite and prickly pear and brush that the cattle would not touch. The cows had avoided it for years. It was 200 acres of what her father had called useless scrub. She had no choice. She could not afford to feed them hay. She needed them to eat something, and that back pasture was all she had left after the front pastures grazed down. She expected them to struggle. She expected to find them thin and weak, and possibly dead from heat stress. She drove her pickup out there on a Tuesday morning, dreading what she would see. Instead, she found them fat. Not just surviving, thriving. Their coats were glossy. Their eyes were bright. They had stripped the leaves off the mesquite. They had eaten the prickly pear pads right through the spines. They had cleared paths through brush so thick that a man could barely walk through it. The ground under the mesquite was covered in goat pellets that looked like dark raisins. Sarah stood in that pasture and she felt the hair stand up on her arms. She pulled out her phone and she started researching right there in the field, with sweat running down her back and goats bleating around her. Goats were browsers, not grazers. Their digestive systems could break down tannins and compounds that cattle could not process. They could extract moisture from succulents. They could utilize land that was considered useless for cattle production. And then she looked at the numbers. A mature Angus cow needed 30 gallons of water per day and 25 pounds of high-quality forage. A goat needed 2 to 3 gallons of water and could survive on brush and weeds. The Mitchell Ranch had hundreds of acres of brushland that the cattle ignored. Land that was actually a liability because it reduced grazing area and harbored predators. For goats, it was a buffet. Sarah realized in that moment that she had not bought an inferior animal. She had bought the exact animal that her land was designed to feed. The accident was not just the discovery of the goat's capability. The accident was the drought itself. Because while Sarah was learning to love her goats, the weather patterns were shifting. The National Weather Service was already issuing warnings that nobody wanted to believe. Rainfall was below average. Reservoirs were dropping. Creek beds that had flowed for decades were turning to cracked mud. Aquifer levels were falling. And by August, the hill country was officially in severe drought. The cattle ranchers were still in denial. They thought it would break. They always thought it would break. Sarah looked at her goats, eating brush in 100-degree heat, and she knew something they did not know. She knew that the world was about to change, and she was the only one who was ready. The transformation began in year 1. Sarah did not just raise goats. She studied them like a scientist. She contacted the Texas A&M Extension Office, and she found a professor who had been trying to get ranchers to consider brush management through targeted grazing for years. Dr. Elena Vargas became her mentor. She drove to College Station twice a month for seminars. She read every research paper she could find on small ruminant nutrition and multi-species grazing. She learned how to rotate the goats through paddocks to clear brush while preserving the root systems that prevented erosion. She learned that the goats were not just livestock. They were land management tools. They were turning her overgrown, useless acres into productive forage land by clearing the invasive species and fertilizing the soil with their manure. By the end of year 1, she had cleared 40 acres of dense mesquite without burning a gallon of diesel or hiring a brush clearing crew. The goats had paid for their purchase price in land management value alone. But the real magic happened when the drought deepened. By October, the cattle ranchers were in full crisis mode. The Angus herds were suffering. The ponds were drying up. The springs that had watered cattle for generations stopped flowing. Hay prices tripled because everyone was buying. Ranchers were forced to sell their breeding stock at a loss just to cut feed bills. The price of beef at auction crashed because the market was flooded with desperate sellers. Hank Brennan called Sarah and asked if she had any hay she could spare. She told him she had not bought hay in 3 months. He thought she was lying until he drove over and saw the goats clearing brush, while his cows stood around a dry trough, looking at him with accusing eyes. Year 2 was about building the business. Sarah kept 25 of her best does, and she bred them to a premium Boer buck she bought from a breeder in New Mexico. She sold 15 of the original goats as meat animals to a halal processor in Houston for $200 a head. That gave her enough capital to build proper handling facilities. She invested in portable electric fencing, and she started rotational grazing in earnest. She divided the ranch into 40 paddocks, and she moved the herd every 3 days. The land responded like a miracle. Native grasses came back in the cleared areas. Wildflowers returned in the spring. The soil held moisture longer because the goat hooves were smaller and less compacting than cattle hooves. She started getting calls from restaurants in Austin and San Antonio. Farm-to-table chefs were looking for locally raised goat meat. It was lean, it was flavorful, it was sustainable, and it was something nobody else was offering. Sarah signed contracts with 3 high-end restaurants at $18 a pound for chevon. That was double what she would have gotten for commodity beef. She hired 2 new employees. Not cowboys. Goat handlers. Young people who were interested in regenerative agriculture and who did not look down on her animals. Maria was 22 and had a degree in animal science from Texas State. Her parents had immigrated from Mexico, and she spoke Spanish with the goats in a way that seemed to calm them. Jake was 19 and had grown up on a failing dairy farm and wanted to try something different. He had a gift for building fences, and he constructed the entire rotational system by hand. By the end of year 2, she had 200 goats, and she had paid off $50,000 of her father's equipment debt. She had also started keeping detailed records. Every goat was tagged. Every birth was logged. Every paddock rotation was mapped. She knew which does produce the fastest growing kids. She knew which bucks threw the best meat conformation. She was running a data-driven operation disguised as a goat ranch. Year 3 was vertical integration. Sarah bought a small dairy processing license, and she started making goat cheese. Chev, feta, aged cheddar. She built a creamery in the old equipment barn where the tractor had once slept. She could stand in that creamery and look at the empty space where the John Deere had sat, and she could smile because that tractor had bought her a future. She learned to pasteurize milk in small batches, and she developed recipes that won awards at the state fair. The aged cheddar took 6 months in the cave she built into the hillside, but when it was ready, the restaurants paid $32 a pound for it. She started a soap line using goat milk and local botanicals like lavender and cedar. She opened the ranch for agritourism on weekends. People drove from Austin to see the operation that everyone had laughed at. They paid $40 a person to tour the ranch and eat a farm lunch. School groups came to learn about sustainable agriculture. Sarah became a speaker at regional farming conferences. She was no longer the crazy goat lady. She was the woman who saw the future before anyone else. And I want to pause right here for just a second. If you are watching this story and you are feeling something right now, I need you to do me a favor. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from today. I read every single comment, and I want to know what city or country has this story reached. Are you watching from a farm in Iowa, or an apartment in London, or a truck stop in Oklahoma? Let me know in the comments. Your story matters to me, and I want to hear from you. Now back to Sarah, because the results are what make this story absolutely unforgettable. By the spring of 2023, the Mitchell Ranch was running 800 goats on the same 1,200 acres that had once struggled to support 200 Angus cattle. The revenue numbers were staggering. The meat operation was grossing $800,000 annually. The cheese and dairy products added another $400,000. The agritourism and direct sales brought in $300,000. Total annual revenue was $1.5 million. Net profit after all expenses was $640,000. She had paid off every penny of her father's $300,000 debt. She owned the land free and clear. She had 3 full-time employees and 4 part-time staff. She had turned the worst pasture on the ranch into the most productive rotational grazing cell. She had restored native grasslands that had not been seen on the property in 40 years. And here is the number that matters most. During the drought of 2022, while her neighbours were losing 40 to 60% of their cattle herds, Sarah lost 0 goats. Not one. Her animals were the only productive livestock in the county that year. While Hank Brennan was selling his breeding stock at a 60% loss, Sarah was selling goat meat at a premium, because demand had spiked when beef became scarce. The 40 skinny goats that everyone laughed at had become the foundation of an empire. But the numbers are only part of the story. The real result was the land itself. Soil tests showed organic matter had increased from 1.2% to 4.1% in the grazed areas. Water infiltration rates had doubled. The ranch was holding water in its ponds that other properties had lost. The goats had created a sponge of living soil that could weather drought in ways that monoculture cattle grazing never could. Sarah had not just saved her ranch. She had regenerated it. She had made it better than it had been in generations. She had proven that the right animal on the right land with the right management could turn a failing operation into a thriving ecosystem. The lesson is simple, but it is not easy. The world will always tell you that the safe choice is the right choice. The world will always mock the person who sees value where others see failure. The world will always worship the Angus and ignore the goat until the drought comes. And the drought always comes. Maybe not in weather. Maybe in markets. Maybe in health. Maybe in relationships. But there is always a moment when the conventional wisdom fails and the person who prepared differently survives. Sarah Mitchell sold her tractor and bought 40 skinny goats because she was willing to look stupid in order to be smart. She was willing to lose the respect of people who did not understand that the future does not look like the past. She was willing to bet on resilience over reputation. She was willing to trade the symbol of her father's success for the seed of her own. And when the drought killed the Angus, her goats were not just alive, they were thriving. They were multiplying. They were proving that the animals everyone dismissed as weak were actually the strongest of all because they were built for the hard times. They were built for the drought. They were built for the land that everyone else had given up on. If you are sitting at your own kitchen table right now with a calculator and a bottle of whiskey, wondering how you are going to make it through the next month, I want you to hear this. Your breakthrough might not look like success to anyone else right now. It might look like a trailer full of skinny goats. It might look like selling your tractor. It might look like the worst decision anyone has ever seen. But if your gut is telling you that there is another way, if your instinct is saying that the path everyone is walking is headed for a cliff, if you can see the brush and the mesquite and the prickly pear, and you know in your soul that there is nourishment there, even though nobody else can taste it, then you need to make the call. You need to sell the tractor. You need to buy the goats. You need to trust the vision that only you can see. Because when the drought comes, and it will come, the people who laughed will be begging you for water. And you will be standing on land that you saved because you were brave enough to be different. Sarah Mitchell is still ranching today. She is expanding to a second property. She consults for ranchers across the Southwest who are trying to transition from failing cattle operations to regenerative goat ranching. She is writing a book. She is living proof that the worst-looking decision can be the best decision of your life. But only if you have the courage to make it. Only if you are willing to be laughed at. Only if you are willing to stand alone in the back pasture at dawn and watch your skinny goats eat the brush that everyone else considers trash, and know with absolute certainty that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The drought kills the herds that are not prepared. The drought spares the ones that adapted before anyone else knew the drought was coming. Be the one who adapts. Be the one who sees. Be the one who survives. And when they ask you how you knew what was coming, you tell them the truth. You did not know when. You just knew that the world changes. And you decided to change first. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell and 40 skinny goats. This is the story of selling your tractor to buy your future. This is the story of being laughed at until the laughter stops and the respect begins. And this is your story too, if you have the guts to write it. So tell me in the comments. What is your tractor? What are your skinny goats? What is the decision that scares you, but will not let you sleep until you make it? I am reading every word. And I believe in you, even if nobody else does yet. Now get up and go build something that lasts.